A village in the mountains has been suffering constant attacks from an S-rank Fenrir, so they spent all of their savings to hire an SS-rank party to defeat it. The members of Flaming Dragon Fang are some of the strongest adventurers in the world, each with their own unique strengths. But then there's Rent, and all he's good for is doing chores. So he's hiding behind a wall to avoid getting hurt. However, Rent is the first person the Fenrir attacks once it arrives, so he is sent flying, and the other members of the party get ready for combat. Golnova orders Bandana to restrain the Fenrir, so she pulls out her wire and ties it up. But a second later, the Fenrir breaks her back against a wall. Normally, Bandana would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. But with Marlefis on the team, she's healed within seconds and gets back to work. She uses a tree to anchor herself to the ground, giving Golnova an opening to aim for the Fenrir's head, so he jumps up and sets it ablaze with his magic sword. The villagers are so happy about the Fenrir's defeat that they prepare a feast for the party, even though the village is almost broke. But Golnova absolutely hates this peasant food. He orders Rent to prepare a decent meal for him instead, and Bandana asks him to make something special, because today is the last day they are going to get to eat Rent's cooking. Rent doesn't understand what they mean by that, so he asks Golnova for an explanation, and he tells Rent that as of today, he is being fired. Rent doesn't understand why they are firing him, so he asks Golnova if he did something wrong, and Golnova says the problem is that Rent isn't doing enough. Sure, he handles the party's chores for them, but aside from that, he is completely useless in combat, and parties are only allowed to have 4 members, so if they want their party to become stronger, they need to replace Rent with a powerful mage, or at least someone who can handle themselves in a fight. Rent pleads with them to let him stay in the party, but Golnova kicks him in the stomach because he is sick of listening to Rent's whining. They don't need him anymore, and that's final. After hitching a ride on a cart, Rent arrived in a city with just a few coins from his last salary in the newly promoted SS rank team, Flaming Dragon Fang, and went to the Hello Work branch to find a job. Upon entering, he was startled to be welcomed by an employee to the Samaela branch of Hello Work Station. As the boy was looking for employment, she explained he needed to undergo an interview and an aptitude test. Sitting down to begin the process, he was asked for his name and age, which he provided as Rent Rock Hans, 15 years old. Answering further questions, he was born in Hast Village in the Sheen Mountains and worked as a jack-of-all-trades for the recently promoted SS rank team, Flaming Dragon Fang, although he had been fired. The employee believed having this service on his resume was a significant advantage for him, making Rent feel grateful that Golnova and his former teammates had afforded him this opportunity. Next, Rent had to undergo an aptitude test, which was a talent granted to him by God, in an attempt to discover his hidden talents. Aptitudes ranged from G rank to SSS, and these levels distinguished the boys from the men, as while a D rank might not cut steel with a certain sword, an A rank could possibly do so using the same blade. Rent hoped for a major turnaround in his life with this test, but the results indicated he was no higher than G rank in all respects. In summary, the boy was a total underachiever, and likely destined for some routine 6-to-1 shift life. But the woman remembered they hadn't tested his forging and alchemy capabilities because the technician wasn't present, so Rent would have to wait about a week to see if he was good at that. The problem was that the boy didn't have enough money to stay in the city for that long, so she thought of another test and asked him to lift a sandbag that was in the room. Upon touching the bag, Rent felt his mana being drained, and he managed to lift the object, but the weight caused his back to bend forward. Nevertheless, the test administrator stated he should be strong enough to handle some construction jobs. Speaking of which, a border town in the Margraviate of Tycone was looking for people to repair its walls, and Rent was pleased to have found a job. Later, as he approached the construction foreman with the introduction letter he had been given, the man glanced at the lad's frail frame and doubted his capability, but since he was short on personnel, it would have to do. Thus, he passed the instructions to Rent to make cement and repair the wall. Rent was about to ask if he should infuse the cement with mana to strengthen it, but he was cut off by the foreman, who would return in 3 hours to check on the situation and expected the worker to have used at least half a barrel by then, with payment depending on performance. As he watched his boss leave, Rent reflected that infusing mana was such a common procedure that the man probably didn't think it necessary to explain. Honestly, he was surprised that half a barrel was considered enough, but regardless, he promised to give his best in this job. 3 hours later, the boss came back to check in and was utterly astounded by what the kid had accomplished. Rent apologized, having run out of cement, but that was hardly the issue. In reality, the fellow, Rent Rockhans, had managed to repair a third of the massive western wall in just that short time. Disbelieving, the adult questioned how the boy reached the higher parts without any scaffolding or ladders nearby, and Rent explained that he put the cement on the end of a very long stick. Conceding after initially underestimating the skinny kid, the boss asked how much longer the young man planned to work there. Rent confessed that staying for a week would be ideal. With that, the man let the employee off and handed him a bag of coins, the most he had on him, promising to pass on the rest later. Rent was stunned to receive so much money, being used to just scraps from his former group, and it greatly motivated him. 3 days later, like the boss, everyone passing by the north and west walls could see and were incredulous at how quickly they were repaired. That day, the contractor told Rent that he didn't need to come from tomorrow onwards, as the kid had simply fixed the entire wall, leaving those who relied on that work for food out of a job. Nevertheless, as a small consolation, the man noted that Rent's performance was of a typical SS rank for this type of job, so he gave the rest of the payment to the boy and recommended that he look for another job in the capital. Interestingly, despite his excellent performance, Rent returned to Hello Work feeling like a failure, as he felt ultimately kicked out. In the middle of another conversation with the clerk, he saw a beautiful girl causing trouble with an attendant. Rent's interviewer went over to settle the dispute and learned that the customer wanted to hire a miner, but insisted on paying based on good results without any advance payment for a mountain with no guarantees. Since that was the case, the employee suggested the client recruit investors to develop the mine, but she argued that the mountain would be confiscated if she didn't pay the taxes within a week. Interrupting the dialogue uninvited, Rent offered to do the job, as he always dug in the mines of his village, but the contractor was not pleased with the worker's ant-like physique, preferring a burly dwarf with a tough look. The problem was, as the employee informed, the woman would have to shell out 10 silver coins for the dwarf, which she made it clear she was unwilling to do, so the deal was to take this kid instead. Finally, after the client left, the workstation clerk commented to her colleague that Rent was too nice. With that adorable look, he could easily work in some leisure lodging, if you catch my drift. Hearing that nonsense, the friend asked Miss Kerschel to get a grip and handed her the card with the rest of the payment that the boy was supposed to receive for the wall repair. The woman glanced at the value of 200 coins and flipped out so much that she lost her balance and fell backward after tripping over the sandbags that Rent had lifted. In fact, the colleague remarked that those weren't sandbags, but rather bags used to measure a person's mana, and they get heavier the more magical energy a person has, though they usually don't react to ordinary people. Actually, it takes mana at the level of a court mage to activate those bags. Hearing this, Kerschel picked up the bag and felt the weight, though not too much at the moment. She remembered Rent struggling greatly to lift that thing, and began to wonder just who this guy was. Speaking of the man, he was led to work in a more remote area, where there was just a small tent where he and the boss were supposed to sleep together. According to her, Rent stated that he couldn't share a tent with a woman as beautiful as Miss Lorraine. This statement left the woman utterly embarrassed, thinking the kid was mocking her, but Rent assured her that he had never seen anyone as beautiful as her in his extensive life of 15 years. Lorraine didn't want to hear it and told the boy to stop talking. She handed the employee some poorly wrapped food, and Rent thought it was great, considering it had been a long time since anyone had cooked anything for him. At night, lying awake, the boy couldn't sleep, and decided to turn to see if the boss lady had fallen asleep. When he laid eyes on the boss, he noticed she was only wearing underwear on the lower part of her body, forcing the poor kid to cover his mouth to muffle the squeak he let out. After that, he lamented that Lorraine was so naive. After all, he was a man. Pretending to be asleep, the woman thought to herself that she had used exactly that strategy to find out if Rent was the type to attack her, but he turned out to be really nice as well as handsome and fun to tease. The next day, she found out that her employee had slept outside the tent all night and noticed that he had fixed the button on her coat. Grateful, Lorraine thought maybe Rent was in the wrong job, but since he was there, she announced that they would start work soon, as she needed to earn 10 gold coins that week. For that, she planned to start digging somewhere nearby, but Rent pointed out that she wouldn't find any ore if she just dug randomly, and that it would be better if he took a look to see if he could find something. As the boss finally gave in, the miner discovered a crystal that alone must be worth about 3 gold coins. Sometime later, Rent examined the surrounding rocks in record time and extracted a large quantity of crystals. Impressed, the boss asked if the next step was to sell these items, but he explained that all but the first were too small to be of much value. The real deal was to transform them into magical crystals. Lorraine thought there were fewer than 10 magical artisans in the kingdom capable of this service, but in a matter of seconds, her new employee performed the process with monstrous ease, usually taking an hour to complete. As night approached, Lorraine bid the boy farewell to sell the magical crystals and planned to return the next morning, while Rent decided to stay and do some things around there. Upon arriving in town to sell the items, Lorraine was asked at the counter about the documents for selling foreign crystals, but she informed them that these were produced domestically. Confused, the soldier asked which workshop she belonged to, so she showed a necklace proving she was an adventurer directly serving the royal family. With that, she gained access to a teleportation stone to go to the capital. Next, Lorraine visited a friend and asked her to buy some of the crystals. The girl assessed that the shine of one of the sample pieces wasn't very strong, so it probably wasn't worth much, perhaps about 10 silver. Lorraine had anticipated some negative surprise due to the short time Rent needed to imbue mana into the items, but suddenly, the buyer reevaluated the crystals and decided she was willing to pay 10 gold just for that crystal because it contained 10 times more mana than usual, and the shine wasn't strong because the crystal had been treated to prevent mana leakage from inside. Having 50 crystals, the buyer placed a bag with 500 gold on the counter without hesitation, but asked for 2 things from her friend. Firstly, she must not sell these magical crystals anywhere but in this store, as it would not be in the kingdom's interest to have such powerful crystals circulating regularly on the market. Secondly, she asked Lorraine to disclose who performed the mana imbuing process on these items, but Rent's boss refused to provide employee information without his permission. At this, with a mild show of authority, the shop owner reminded her that she was a court mage with the status of an honorary count, meaning this was an order. However, Lorraine argued that she no longer served the royal family and did not have to obey such an order, so the friend gave up and only asked her to ensure that the responsible party did not leave the country and to inform him that she was offering him the position of director of a royal magical technology research laboratory with the title of honorary baron or even honorary count. After leaving the store, Lorraine returned to where her miner was and discovered that he had built a wooden house on the site in less than a day. She asked him about it, and the boy found it normal, explaining that people usually do this in his hometown,